The day my wife turned down $20 million, she didn't cry. She didn't argue. She read the last line of the document twice, set it face down on the lawyer's desk like it had gone cold in her hands, and said, "No, thank you, but no." Nobody in that room moved for a full 5 seconds. Not the lawyer. Not my mother-in-law. Not me. $20 million doesn't get turned down quietly. Not in my experience. And I've spent 14 years around estates, trusts, and every version of a family fighting over money. People cry for that kind of number. People sue for that kind of number. My wife looked at it like it was an insult. I didn't understand it that afternoon. I didn't understand it for 3 more weeks. Not until a retired mill worker in a cardigan 2 sizes too big sat across from me at his kitchen table and told me what he'd watched happen 31 years ago and what it had cost him to stay quiet about it ever since. By the time I understood, I wished I still didn't. Before we dive deeper, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you. And don't forget to hit that subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. My wife's name is Emma. The man offering her $20 million was Vernon Kaufman, 81 years old, dying of pancreatic cancer, and the closest thing Emma had to a father since she was 9. He wasn't family by blood. He was better than that, or so I'd always believed. Her late father's business partner and best friend, the man who paid for her braces, her class trips, half her law school tuition, without ever once asking for a thank you card in return. When his own doctors gave him 4 months, maybe 5, Vernon decided he wanted to leave the bulk of his estate to Emma before he ran out of time to see her face when she got it. There was only one condition attached to the gift, buried in legal language on page 11 of a 14-page document. And the moment Emma reached that page, something in her expression closed like a door. Why would a woman who grew up scraping by refuse a fortune from the one man who'd always taken care of her? What was on page 11? And why did my mother-in-law, usually the loudest person in any room, go so quiet she looked like she'd stopped breathing? My name is Nathan Whitaker. I'm a corporate and family attorney, 37 years old, and after 14 years of practice, I like to think very little surprises me anymore. My wife has a habit of proving me wrong. Emma and I have been married for 12 years. We have 2 kids, our son Silas, 10 years old, quiet and watchful, in a way that reminds me of Emma at her most guarded, and our daughter Hazel, 7, who has never met a silence she didn't want to fill. My mother-in-law, Marjorie Sanford, lives 20 minutes from us and has strong opinions about all of it. My career, my cooking, and especially my in-laws by marriage, of which, as far as I knew, there had only ever been one man worth mentioning, Vernon Kaufman. Emma's father, Ivan Sanford, died when she was 9 years old. I never met him. What I knew came in fragments, offered rarely and never elaborated on. That he'd worked for decades at Kaufman Steelworks, a mid-sized industrial mill an hour outside the city that had, at its peak, employed nearly 400 people across 2 shifts. That he'd died there in an accident the official report called equipment failure. That Marjorie had been left with a 9-year-old daughter, a modest widow's pension, and a grief she wore like a permanent second skin. And that Vernon Kaufman, Ivan's closest friend, and, at the time, the plant's floor manager, had shown up at the funeral and never really left. He paid off the mortgage on the house Marjorie could no longer afford a loan. He showed up to Emma's school plays when Marjorie was working double shifts to make ends meet. He wrote checks for braces, for a used car when Emma turned 17, for a chunk of her law school tuition that Emma didn't fully appreciate until she was sitting across from her own student loan statements years later. grateful someone had cared enough to lighten the load. By the time I met Emma in our second year of law school, Vernon Kaufman wasn't a family friend anymore. He was, in every way that mattered except paperwork, the father she had lost. I liked him, genuinely. He had this unhurried, grandfatherly way of listening to you that made you feel like the only person in the room, and at our wedding he gave a toast that made half the guests cry, mine included. If you'd asked me, before all this, to name one person outside our immediate family who I'd trust with my kids without a second thought, I would have said Vernon Kaufman without hesitation. What I noticed, but never dug into, was Marjorie's silence around him. She was cordial. She let him into holidays, into birthdays, into hospital waiting rooms when Hazel was born early and we needed help fast. But she never once, in 12 years of marriage, called him a friend. She called him Vernon, flatly, the way you'd name a weather pattern you'd learn to live around, rather than a person you were fond of. When I once asked Emma about it, she shrugged and said her mother had never really forgiven anyone for her father dying, Vernon included, even though it wasn't his fault. I took that at face value. It made sense to me. Grief distorts people. I'd seen it in 100 clients over the years, watched them direct fury at doctors, at insurance companies, at innocent bystanders, simply because fury needs somewhere to go. So when Vernon's diagnosis came 6 months ago, stage 4, inoperable, the kind of prognosis that reorganizes a person's remaining priorities overnight, none of us were shocked that his first call was to his estate attorney, and none of us were shocked that Emma's name was the only one that mattered in that conversation. He had no children of his own. His wife had passed a decade earlier. Kaufman Steelworks itself had been sold off in pieces years ago, the physical plant demolished, the land now a logistics park with a different company's name on the sign. All that remained of Vernon's life's work was the money it had generated, sitting in trusts and investment accounts that had quietly grown, year over year, into something enormous. $20 million, give or take, once the various accounts were consolidated. All of it, by Vernon's explicit design, meant for Emma. I remember driving to the reading of his final gift documents. Not a will, since he was still alive, but a formal inter vivos transfer he wanted executed while he could still watch it happen, and feeling nothing but a kind of quiet gratitude. Our kids' college funds, taken care of. The mortgage, gone. A cushion under our family that neither of us had grown up with. I remember thinking, uncharitably, that this was the easiest 14 pages of legal paper I'd ever sit through in my career. I was wrong about that, in a way I still think about. Vernon's estate attorney was a precise, silver-haired man named Bertrand Spear, the kind of lawyer who'd clearly spent 40 years learning to say enormous numbers in the same even tone he'd used to order coffee. His office sat on the top floor of a restored brick building in downtown Boulder. Floor-to-ceiling windows behind him, framing the flatirons like a postcard, nobody in the room was in the mood to admire. Vernon sat in a wheelchair at the head of the conference table, thinner than I'd ever seen him, a blanket over his knees despite the mild afternoon outside. He'd insisted on being present for this. I want to watch her face, he'd told Emma on the phone the week before, and she'd repeated it to me afterward, with an odd catch in her voice I hadn't thought to question. Marjorie sat to my left, arms crossed, jaw set in a way I'd learned over the years to read as bracing rather than angry. Emma sat directly across from Vernon, and I sat beside her, more out of habit than necessity. This wasn't my transaction to review, and Spear had made it clear from the outset that Vernon had his own independent counsel, confirming everything was airtight, no undue influence, no coercion, a gift given with full clarity of mind. The first 10 pages were exactly what I expected. Asset schedules, transfer mechanics, a generous, almost embarrassingly thorough accounting of exactly what Emma would receive and how quickly it would clear once signed. Silas and Hazel's names appeared twice. In optional education trust provisions, Vernon had added without being asked, and I watched Emma's eyes go glassy reading her children's names in a dying man's gift to her. Then Spear turned to page 11, and his voice changed register, just slightly. The practiced neutrality of a man delivering a clause he'd been specifically instructed to present without editorializing. Section 7, he read. Acceptance of this gift, in its entirety, is conditioned upon the beneficiary's execution of the attached confidentiality and non-disparagement agreement pertaining to any and all matters relating to the operations, safety practices, incidents, and closure of Kaufman Steelworks prior to the year 2000, including but not limited to the death of Ivan Sanford. I read it twice before it fully landed. A $20 million inheritance, conditioned on Emma signing away her right to ever discuss, publicly or privately, anything related to her own father's death. I read the clause a third time, the lawyer in me automatically parsing it the way I would for any client, looking for the loophole, the narrower version of the language that might make it survivable. There wasn't one. It wasn't a standard confidentiality clause protecting trade secrets or settlement terms. It was a blanket silence, permanent and irrevocable, covering the single most consequential fact of my wife's childhood, the death of her own father, in exchange for a number with 7 zeros after it. I drafted plenty of NDAs in my career. I'd never seen one built around a grief instead of a business dispute. I looked at Vernon. His hands, folded in his lap, had gone white-knuckled around each other, and he was watching Emma with an expression I couldn't place at the time. Not smugness, not manipulation exactly, something closer to a man bracing for a verdict he already suspected. Emma read the clause herself, slowly, her finger tracing the line as though she needed the physical confirmation that the words meant what they appeared to mean. Then she read the entire 14 pages again from the beginning, in total silence, while the rest of us sat there not daring to speak. When she finished, she set the document face down on the desk. "No," she said. Quiet, steady. Nothing like the voice I associated with confrontation. "Thank you, Vernon." "But no." Spear blinked, clearly having anticipated tears, maybe gratitude, maybe negotiation over the specific wording of the NDA. Anything but a flat refusal, delivered like she'd been asked whether she wanted more coffee. "Emma," Vernon said, and his voice cracked in a way I'd never heard from him. "You don't understand what this means for your family. For Silas. For Hazel. I am trying to give you—" "I understand exactly what it means," Emma said, and for the first time since we'd sat down, she looked at her mother instead of at Vernon. "Don't I, Mom?" Marjorie's face had gone the color of the blank legal pad in front of her. She didn't answer. She didn't need to. Whatever passed between the two of them in that silence was a conversation I wasn't part of, and, I understood instantly, had never been part of for 28 years. "I think we're done here," Emma said, standing, and I stood with her out of pure reflex, my mind still lagging 4 sentences behind whatever had just happened in that room. Vernon called her name once, softly, as we reached the door. Emma stopped, her hand on the frame, and looked back at him with something that wasn't quite anger and wasn't quite grief, a version of both I'd never seen on her face in 12 years of marriage. "You should have told me yourself," she said. 31 years ago would have been fine." Then she walked out, and Marjorie followed, and I stood in the doorway of a stranger's law office holding a folder worth $20 million that my wife had just handed back like it was something that had spoiled in the sun. Bertrand Spear, to his credit, didn't try to stop me or chase after some version of a counteroffer. He simply gathered the pages back into their leather folder, squared the edges twice out of what looked like pure professional habit, and said quietly that he'd known Vernon for 30 years and had never once seen him look as relieved as he did in the second before Emma said no. I didn't understand that sentence at the time either. I filed it away with everything else from that room I couldn't yet make sense of, and I drove home with the particular unease of a man who has just watched his wife walk away from more money than either of us would earn in 10 combined lifetimes, and felt, underneath the shock, an instinct telling me she was right to do it before I had any evidence to justify that instinct at all. I didn't ask Emma anything on the drive home. I'd learned, over a decade of marriage, that some silences need room before they'll open on their own, and this was clearly one of them. She sat with her forehead against the passenger window the entire way, and Marjorie followed us in her own car, headlights steady in my rearview mirror, the whole route, like she was making sure we actually made it home. It was Marjorie, not Emma, who finally talked, later that night, after the kids were asleep, and the three of us sat around our kitchen table, with tea none of us drank. "Your father didn't die because of equipment failure," she said, staring at a spot on the table, rather than at either of us. "That's what the report said. That's what I let everyone believe for 28 years, because it was easier than the truth, and because Vernon asked me to, and because grief makes you agree to things you shouldn't." I felt my pulse pick up in the specific way it does when a client is about to tell me something that changes the entire shape of a case. "Vernon was the floor manager," Marjorie continued. "Ivan worked the press line under him. There'd been problems with the safety interlock on machine 4 for weeks. Ivan told me about it at dinner. More than once. Complained that maintenance kept getting pushed back because the plant was behind quota that quarter. The morning he died, that interlock had been bypassed. Not broken, bypassed. Someone made a decision to keep the line running instead of shutting it down for repairs, and my husband was standing in the wrong place when it failed. Did Vernon make that decision? I asked, already knowing, from the way her jaw tightened, that he had. I never had proof, Marjorie said. Just Ivan's complaints, and a company report that closed the case in 4 days flat, and a floor manager who showed up at my door within the week, promising to take care of us for the rest of our lives. I told myself for a long time that guilt and generosity can look the same from the outside. I let him in because we needed him, and because some small ugly part of me thought if he was buying our silence, he could pay for it the rest of his life. She twisted her wedding ring, still worn 28 years later, around her finger, the way I'd noticed her do at moments of real strain. There were nights, early on, I almost asked him directly. I'd get the question halfway to my mouth, and then look at Emma asleep in the next room, in a house he was quietly making sure we could keep, and I'd swallow it back down. It got easier to swallow every year after that. That's the part I'm least proud of. Not that I suspected him, that I let the suspecting get comfortable. Emma finally spoke, her voice thinner than I was used to. I found his complaint about the interlock 2 years ago, going through Dad's old things in Mom's garage. A notebook, just a page, dated a week before he died. She looked at me. I never told you. I didn't know what to do with it. It wasn't proof of anything. Not really. Just a man complaining about work. I put it back in the box and didn't think about it again until today, when I saw that clause. I sat with that for a long moment, feeling the particular vertigo of realizing my own wife had been carrying something for 2 years that she hadn't handed me, and understanding, underneath the sting of it, exactly why. Some things you can't say out loud until you're forced to. "Here's what I don't understand," I said finally, my attorney's brain doing what it always does when emotion gets too heavy to sit inside comfortably, reaching for the next actionable fact. If this happened 31 years ago, and the official cause was ruled equipment failure, what is Vernon actually afraid of now? What does an NDA protect him from at 81, dying, with no company left to lose? Marjorie looked at me like she'd been waiting for someone to ask the right question. "There were others," she said quietly. "Other families. I heard rumors for years. A man on the night shift who lost 2 fingers the same year. A woman in the packing department who nearly died from a chemical exposure they blamed on her own carelessness. If someone ever put those stories next to Ivan's death, next to whatever Vernon actually knew about that interlock, it stops being one tragic accident. It starts being a pattern. And patterns are the kind of thing that outlive a company, and outlive a man's obituary, if somebody's still around to tell them. If you've made it this far into the story, go ahead and drop a comment telling me what you'd have done in that kitchen, because I promise you, I didn't know yet myself. I didn't sleep much that night. Somewhere around 2 in the morning, I found myself doing what I do with every case that doesn't sit right in my stomach. Pulling threads, quietly, before I said anything to Emma that might get her hopes up or crush them further. I remembered a name from a case I'd consulted on years earlier. A freelance investigative journalist named Ione Rios, who'd spent a chunk of her career writing about industrial safety failures in the Mountain West. The kind of reporting that wins small awards and changes almost nothing about the industries it exposes. I found an old email address and sent her 3 sentences before I could talk myself out of it. An old mill, an old death, a name, Kaufman Steelworks, and a question. Had she ever come across it in her research? She wrote back within 6 hours. Yes. She had a file on Kaufman Steelworks going back years, shelved after her original source got spooked and stopped returning calls. She wanted to meet. I told Emma the next morning, half expecting her to tell me to drop it, that some things were better left in a garage box where they'd been sitting quietly for 2 years. Instead, she looked at me with something like relief, like she'd been hoping someone else would be the one to say it out loud first. If Dad died because somebody decided a quota mattered more than a safety interlock, she said, I'm not signing anything that tells the world it was just bad luck. I don't care what it costs us. The next 2 weeks were quieter than I expected them to be, and more tense for exactly that reason. Vernon called twice. Emma let both calls go to voicemail. Marjorie started sleeping over more, ostensibly to help with the kids. Actually, I think, because she didn't want Emma facing any of this alone the way she once had. Silas noticed something was different. He's always been the one who reads a room before anyone tells him what's in it, and asked me directly one night if Grandma and Mom were fighting with Uncle Vernon. I told him the truth, in the smallest version a 10-year-old could carry, that sometimes grown-ups discover old things weren't as simple as they'd been told, and that we were figuring out what to do about it together. Hazel, for her part, mostly wanted to know whether Uncle Vernon would still come to her next birthday, and I remember not having an honest answer ready for that one at all. If this kind of story is the reason you keep coming back to this channel, do me a favor and hit that subscribe button, and turn on notifications so you don't miss what Ione found, because it was worse than any of us expected, including me. Ione and I met in person 11 days after that first email, at a diner near her office with case files instead of menus spread across the table between us. She'd spent those 11 days pulling old county records, insurance filings, and the piece that changed everything, locating a name she'd lost touch with years earlier. A retired Kaufman Steelworks maintenance technician named Ivo Prather, who had once, briefly, tried to talk to her on the record before disappearing from her calls entirely. He signed something back then too, Ione told me, sliding a faded photocopy across the table. I could never prove what, but I always had a theory about who might have been paying for his silence. I already knew the answer before she finished the sentence. Ivo Prather lived 2 hours west, in a small house at the end of a gravel road with a wood stove going despite the mild weather and a cardigan that looked like it had outlived several decades of winters. He was 79, sharp-eyed despite a slight tremor in his hands, and when Ione introduced me as Emma's husband, something in his face shifted from wary to resigned, like a man who'd known this conversation was only postponed, never canceled. I wondered when someone would finally come asking, he said, before we'd even sat down. Ione had found him through nothing more glamorous than a decade-old byline in a small regional paper and 3 afternoons on the phone with retired union reps who remembered him fondly enough to pass along a current address, even after he'd gone quiet on every reporter who'd ever called before her. She told me on the drive out that this was the unglamorous truth of most real investigative work. Not dramatic break-ins or anonymous tips slipped under a door, but patient, boring persistence. One disconnected phone number and one retired coworker at a time, until a name finally led somewhere a person still lived. He told it slowly, in the unhurried cadence of a man who had rehearsed the story in his own head 1,000 times without ever saying it aloud. He'd worked maintenance at Kaufman Steelworks for 6 years, and the interlock failures on the press line had been a running complaint among the floor crew for over a month before Ivan Sanford died. NBX to Ivo. Ivo himself had flagged it twice in writing, requesting a shutdown for repairs. Both requests had gone to the same desk, Vernon Kaufman's, then the plant's floor manager, a decade away from ever owning the place outright. Vernon told me quota mattered more than a hypothetical, Ivo said. Those were close to his exact words. Said if the interlock hadn't failed in 6 years, it wasn't about to fail that week. He had the bypass switch installed himself. Temporary, he said, just to get through the quarter. 3 days later, Ivan was standing at that press when it cycled without the guard engaged. He pulled a folder from a drawer that had clearly been waiting for this exact moment for longer than I wanted to think about. A photocopy of his original written safety complaint, dated 11 days before the accident, and a second document, a sworn affidavit he drafted himself 20 years ago, after his conscience finally outweighed his fear, then never filed anywhere, because the week after he wrote it, Vernon had shown up at his own door with a settlement offer and a confidentiality agreement generous enough to buy Ivo's silence and a modest retirement besides. I told myself Ivan's widow was already being taken care of, Ivo said, and for the first time his composure cracked. I told myself that made it even somehow. It didn't. It just meant 2 men got paid to stay quiet about the same dead man, and neither one of us ever really slept right again. He told us he'd driven past the old plant site twice a year, every year, long after it had been torn down and replaced with a logistics warehouse with somebody else's name on the sign, just to remind himself what his silence had actually been worth. You start telling yourself the settlement was for the fingers I lost feeling in, working that floor, he said, holding up a hand with a faint, permanent tremor. Eventually you run out of parts of yourself to blame it on, and you're just left with the plain fact of it. I helped bury a good man's death because it was easier than losing my own paycheck at 48 years old, with 2 kids in the house. He signed a new statement that afternoon, this one with no conditions attached, and handed it to Ione, along with copies of everything he'd kept hidden for 2 decades. Before we left, he asked us to wait a moment, went into a back room, and returned with a small tin box he said he hadn't opened in years. Inside it, a faded photograph of the old floor crew. Ivan Sanford, grinning in the second row, an arm slung around a much younger Ivo. He used to bring his little girl by on Bring Your Kid to Work days, Ivo said, tapping the edge of the photo. She'd have been about 7. I think about that more than I'd like to admit. I called Emma from the car before I'd even left Ivo's driveway. I didn't soften it. I've learned over the years that the people you love deserve the same respect you'd give a client. The whole truth, delivered plainly, so they can decide for themselves what to do with it, rather than being managed toward a version you think they can handle. It wasn't an accident, I told her. Vernon bypassed the safety interlock himself to protect a production number. There's a written complaint from before it happened, and a sworn statement from a man he paid to disappear afterward. The silence on the other end of the line lasted long enough that I said her name twice before she answered. He's been raising me out of guilt for 28 years, she said finally, and her voice had a flatness to it I'd never heard. Not grief exactly, something closer to a woman recalculating the entire architecture of her own life. Every graduation, every tuition check, my wedding toast. All of it was never love, Nathan. It was a man trying to buy himself something he couldn't actually have. Maybe it was both, I said, because I genuinely believed that, and still do. People aren't usually only one thing. That doesn't make what he did to your father any less true. We drove to Marjorie's house together that evening to tell her everything, and I watched 28 years of careful, deliberate not knowing finally collapse across her face, replaced by something that looked almost like relief, the specific relief of a person who has spent decades suspecting a truth and finally no longer has to wonder. I always knew, she said quietly. I just never let myself finish knowing it. Vernon had 4 weeks left by the time we confronted him, according to his own doctors, though in the end, he had barely 2. We went to see him at his house rather than the hospital, at Emma's insistence. She wanted this conversation to happen somewhere he couldn't hide, behind machines and nurses and the general deference people extend to the visibly dying. He didn't deny a word of it. I think, in some exhausted corner of himself, he'd been waiting 31 years for someone to finally make him say it out loud. I made a decision in 4 seconds that I have spent the rest of my life trying to outrun, he said, oxygen tube looped under his nose, hands trembling in his lap in a way that had nothing to do with his illness. I told myself, at first, that the interlock probably would have held. Then I told myself Ivan's family was better off with me in their lives than without me. Then I told myself so many versions of that story that some days I nearly believed the official report myself. The money was never a bribe, Emma. I need you to understand that. It started as guilt, and somewhere along the way it became the only kind of love I knew how to offer, because I never let myself deserve the honest kind. He told us about the 4 seconds themselves, in more detail than I think he'd ever allowed himself before. The sound the press made when it cycled without the guard engaged. The specific color of the warning light he'd overridden with a key he wasn't supposed to have. The fact that he'd walked past Ivan's station twice that same morning and said nothing, because saying something would have meant admitting, out loud, to men who reported to him that he'd made a choice that put their safety beneath a production target. I have run that morning back through my mind more times than I could count, you, he said, I used to think if I ran it back enough times, I'd eventually find the version where I said something. I never did. There isn't one. You could have told me any time in 28 years, Emma said, and I heard in her voice the specific exhaustion of someone who had already, somewhere in the last 2 weeks, moved past fury and into something more complicated. You chose 31 years of silence and then tried to buy one more with a 14-page document. I was afraid, Vernon said simply. Not of prison, of you looking at me the way you're looking at me right now. Emma didn't cry, and she didn't accept his apology. Not fully, not in the tidy way these conversations sometimes resolve in the stories people tell afterward. What she did instead was lay out, plainly, what she needed from him, instead of $20 million and a signature. She didn't want a lawsuit. She didn't want his name dragged through headlines in the last weeks of his life. Not because he deserved protection, but because a public scandal would also drag Ivan's death back into tabloid shorthand, and because Ivo Prather, at 79, had asked for exactly one thing in exchange for finally telling the truth: that his name never appear in a newspaper. What Emma wanted instead was restitution with no strings and no silence attached, an irrevocable trust, funded with the same money that would have come to her, redirected instead toward every family Ion's research could still identify from Kaufman Steelworks' worst years. The man with 2 missing fingers, the woman from the packing department, anyone still alive, or any descendants who could be found. Administered by an independent trustee with no confidentiality clause anywhere in the paperwork. No NDA, Emma said. Not for me. Not for anyone this touches. If people ask what happened to that money, the answer is the truth, plainly told, for as long as anyone's willing to listen. Vernon signed the new documents 9 days before he died, in the presence of his own attorney, and, at Emma's insistence, no one else from our family. Bertrand Spear called me the morning after the funeral to confirm the trust had been executed exactly as instructed. No gag clauses, no naming rights, no plaque with Vernon Kaufman's name on a building anywhere. Just money, moving quietly toward the people it always should have belonged to. Ione's records eventually turned up 6 more families the trust could reach. The man with the 2 missing fingers, now in his 80s, and still living alone outside the city. The woman from the packing department, whose granddaughter cried on the phone when the independent trustee first called. A widow in her 70s, whose husband had died of a lung condition the plant's old paperwork blamed entirely on his smoking habit. None of them got a number close to 20 million. All of them got the same thing Emma insisted on for herself: the truth, on the record, alongside whatever the trust could actually pay them. Marjorie attended the funeral. Emma didn't, and I didn't push her to. Some forms of forgiveness look like showing up, and some look like finally allowing yourself not to. Silas asked me, a few nights later, whether Uncle Vernon had been a bad person. I told him the truest thing I had, the same thing I've come to believe after 14 years of watching people's worst decisions sit right alongside their most genuine love. That a person can do something unforgivable and still spend the rest of his life trying, imperfectly, to make something good out of the wreckage of it. Whether that adds up to redemption or just a longer, quieter kind of guilt is something I don't think any of us gets to decide for someone else. I think about the moment Emma set that folder face down on Bertrand Spear's desk more than I think about almost anything else from this past year. $20 million, and she never hesitated. I used to think I understood exactly what my wife valued. I've since learned there's a difference between knowing someone for 12 years and knowing what they'd refuse, unhesitatingly, the very first time it actually mattered. I've told a lot of stories from inside my own family over the past several months, but this one has sat with me differently than most, and I think it's because there was no courtroom moment to make it feel resolved, no dramatic verdict, just a quiet trust document and a funeral my wife chose not to attend. Real endings rarely arrive as clean as the ones we're used to watching. Sometimes the most honest resolution is simply deciding what you refuse to carry forward, and what you insist on setting right instead, even when nobody's forcing you to. I keep coming back to Emma's answer when I asked her, weeks later, whether she regretted turning down that kind of money, without even sleeping on it first. She told me some decisions don't need time, because you already know, in your body, before your mind finishes catching up to the reasons. I think about that a lot, honestly, in my own work, in the choices I watch clients agonize over that they usually already know the answer to before they ever walk into my office. If this story moved you even a little, do me a favor and hit that like button before you go. It genuinely helps stories like ours find the people who need to hear them. And if you've got thoughts on what Emma did, or what you'd have done in her place, I'd really love to read them, so drop a comment below and let me know. If you know someone who's ever had to choose between money and the truth, or between protecting someone's memory and protecting someone's guilt, send this their way. I think they'll feel this one the way a lot of you have told me you felt the others. Make sure you're subscribed and that your notifications are turned on, because I've got another one of these coming soon, and I never want any of you to miss where this family ends up next. And before you go, tell me in the comments where in the world you're watching this from tonight. I read every single one, and it means more than you probably know to see just how far these stories travel. Until the next one, take care of the people who tell you the truth, even when it's late.